It's a bit unfortunate that the first track I have to replace is the Prelude. It feels as if no matter what I'm able to come up with, it'll be awful in comparison. This is what happens when you try to do something stupid with something so beloved. Beloved. Anyway, here goes. I didn't understand much about the Prelude until I watched this wonderful video by GameScore Fanfare. The link will be in the description, and I wholly recommend that you go over there and watch it, perhaps even before you continue watching this video. Much of what I will say is probably better explained via that video. Prelude is an interesting thing to try and replace. While it is the first track that we as players of the game hear, it's actually the last piece that was written for the game. Like the video I suggested for you to watch shows, seriously, go watch it. Uematsu details this and one other important thing to know about the track. He was given only 30 minutes to compose it. I have no idea what I would do if I were told I had to compose something in 30 minutes, but the resulting structure of the song I feel is directly because of that time limit. Prelude is simple. Not deceptively simple, just straight up simple. But its simplicity hasn't been a hindrance, but rather an asset as the series has continued to exist. I don't feel that when Uematsu wrote this, that it was impressive. Looking at it objectively, there isn't anything complicated about it. There isn't a melody that catches your ear and won't let go. This was made in less than 30 minutes. What makes it impressive is how he, and others since, have adapted the song's structure to accent other pieces of music in the series. There are a couple of examples that were shown in the aforementioned video that I didn't even realize contained elements from the Prelude. So what makes this song tick? Well, it's 1, 2, 3, and 5. Or C, D, E, and G. The song is entirely made of arpeggiated chords, repeating 1, 2, 3, 5 times 4 and repeating on its way back down. This remains uniform throughout the entire track, always playing 1, 2, 3, 5 arpeggios for whatever chords end up getting used. When structure like this is used, it doesn't really matter what chord or scale you end up using, you'll get a similar sounding result. Now that I've tried explaining what I've recently learned, what do I need to do in order to create a replacement track? We know a few things that should be kept in mind. It needs to be simple enough to be incorporated into other pieces of music in the future. It needs to be structured with rules that allow for changing in a predictable way. And it needs to contain an atmosphere that influences the listener. We didn't go into detail about the environment that Prelude creates, but I get a sense of almost an ethereal mystery. In later versions of the song, a melody is created using Prelude as the harmony. Before this, I never feel like there's a resolution to the song. It can keep playing indefinitely, and I never feel that the song is concluded. It doesn't necessarily make me feel that something's missing, but until the melody got added, I actually don't know what game that extra melody got in. Was it 7? It felt endless, and it felt good. These are the parameters that I'm going to be trying to work with. After accepting all of this information, the first thing that came to my mind was a track that I wrote 8 or so years ago. It was entirely made up of arpeggios and conveniently started and remained in C major. There is even a similar structure here, sort of reinforcing my previous points. Instead of using 1 2 3 5 times 4, I used 1 3 5 1 3 5 1, with the last note in the arpeggio intending to be the melody built in. In the first bar, I used ACE, ACE, AE, and with the adjustments, the next bars looked something like this. Then, I went lower and did a similar thing with a different chord. This melody is by no means complicated and in fact could be used as a harmony in many other applications. Over the years, I found myself recognizing that I actually write harmonies for harmonies rather than melodies for harmonies. I'm not sure if it's a skill issue or the result is just something I'm happy with, but this may be an important thing to note for future tracks I create. Anyway, this track accomplishes all three of my goals that I set out to do earlier. It's simple, structured, and creates an atmosphere that I view fondly for the application. However, I will not allow myself to just copy and paste my previous work and call it quits with no effort. Instead, I'd like to use the structure and do some adjustments to sort of field test how well it can be adjusted with predictable results. For starters, I want my prelude to be a couple of drops darker in tone. Nothing that screams horror, just a bit more of the mystery rather than the ethereal. I'm starting with an adjustment to the structure of the arpeggio. Instead of going 1 3 5, I'm going to be going with 1 3 6. I cannot begin to tell you what this does and why, but I find it changes the way I feel about it in a good way. That's all the justification I need. I'm choosing to begin with C, so the resulting notes would be C, E, then A, followed by the same style of top note melody from my reference track, adjusted accordingly. Instead of using eighth notes, I'm adding a little bit of rhythmic diversity in the form of a half note, an eighth note, and a quarter note to make up the mini arpeggio like so. This variation is important to me, and we'll go into a little bit more detail as to why I chose this particular rhythm a little later. Much like in the example track, I retained the downshift into a lower chord, this time starting with F and using F-A-D, and I also continued to use the high note variation. One thing that I forgot to mention, there's also a factor of time that plays into these songs. For a particular few, such as the one I have to do after this track, the timing is incredibly important. Prelude is not one of those, but I would still like to keep the original tracks and my tracks at a similar length. Based on my figures, the original repeats itself every 42 seconds, where mine will do so every 64 seconds. That's probably close enough for this piece. But what I have so far is too boring to leave as is. The bonus of having eighth notes at a relatively high tempo is that you're constantly getting something new to listen to, coupled with what I mentioned earlier about never resolving. This resolves and thus needs something additional. After the pattern repeats twice, I created a melody to accompany this harmony. I wanted to add some notes in the higher registers to add some air to the piece. I don't really know how to describe that, but harmony alone makes it feel a little bit earthy or muddy. I started out with CEA ascending for the harmony, so I went with CAE descending in eighth notes for a bit of contrast and rhythm. This was followed by the same thing, but with E an octave higher. To descend to the next chord, I introduced G and F before landing on E, which leads me on a little tangent. Notes that exist on a piano typically do not sound good when played side by side. This isn't like a 100% guaranteed thing, because when two notes are played side by side with context, or if they're played with different instruments, the dissonance can be nice. The reason why I say this is when I end up on F, the harmony is playing E an octave lower. This gives just enough dissonance for me to be happy. For things I find interesting, I will explain my thought process, but not every note will be interesting. Instead, I'll skip it and say, and then I finished up the melody, which I'm kind of doing now. So here's what I ended up with. So the structure of this sounds fine to me, but the instrumentation does not. This is where I start talking about what I want to express with the song. When I think of FF1, I cannot forget about Strangers of Paradise. It's arguable that it's a different telling of the story, that it isn't canon to the story of the original game. I do not take that side of the argument, and believe that the story we play in FF1 is immediately after the story of Stranger of Paradise concludes. We play as the Warriors of Light that do actually end the cycle. The words that come closest to describing the sound I desire is snow globe, followed by music box. I've never actually opened a snow globe, but I imagine the way it works is similar to a music box. Anyway, I imagine the Lufanians watching over these cycles, which feels like the parallels line up for me. Whether or not they can see what's happening after Jack broke the cycle is something I'm unsure of. I like lore and all, but details like this are lost to me. In summary, I want something that evokes that sound. Thankfully, I found just the thing. It's closer, but it's not quite there yet. I'd like to have what I call shimmer reverb to evoke thoughts of crystal or glass. It is, after all, what the player is going to be after during the story. After adding some Valhalla Supermassive, this is our final product. So in the end, we have a simple track that follows simple rules from manipulation. We have a track that evokes in, at least myself, a feeling of sorrow and mourning for the things that happened before FF1, but minimizes it for those that maybe haven't played. Whew. This seems like a lot of words for a minute of audio. How did I do? I'd love to hear your opinions, even if they aren't positive. I know it's hard to compare anything with Nobuo Uematsu's classic songs, and in doing so, I've opened myself up to tons of criticism. Regardless of what you might think of my prelude, I'd like to thank you for watching. Next, I'll be attempting the music for the opening movie, which will likely be a much less interesting piece of music. If you like this, please consider subscribing for that one. And thanks again, and see you soon.